Welcome back to All Things Money. I'm David Blain, and in today's last segment, we're going to answer a listener's question about China. They had a question about China and all the press that you see about China's growing economic and military might, and they just wondered what I thought of it as an investment. And that's a great question. We have been big supporters of both emerging markets as a whole. The big ones are Brazil, Russia, India, China, along with Eastern Europe, other parts of Asia, emerging economies out there. And of those, China is arguably the largest. So we've been big supporters of emerging markets, investing a lot of money in them. We also were big investors in China and had been for many years. Although this past year we have backed off to instead of overweighting China, we're just sort of at a neutral weight. And the reason for that is manyfold, but essentially if I could sum it up in one statement, is China is very rapidly emerging or departing from the emerging market status and moving into developed status. And depending on which statistics you look at, a lot of China disputes it, but some world bodies have reported that China is now the #1 consumer of oil in the world. And so as people continue to point fingers at the United States for being the energy hog of the world, although our per capita consumption is still much higher than China, if we're not this month, we certainly will be in the next several months, no longer the largest consumer of oil in the world. We're certainly, for pollution, China is one of the largest polluters. Anyway, so getting back to the topic, so we've backed off on the China investment just a little bit because we think China is facing some major headwinds. Among them, a lot of this comes from a gentleman by the name of Simon Hunt, who does a lot of extensive traveling and writing on China, and he reports some of these problems. Home affordability is a big problem. Leadership instability, a potential, if not already, frankly, an actual housing bubble. The rising income and wealth differential between those who have made it and those who have not. You hear a lot in the U.S. press about the haves and the have-nots and the rich and the middle class and the poor and how the rich have everything. It is nothing compared to a country like China, where you have, literally billions of people subsisting on $1 a day. And did you know that the world's largest market now for Ferrari is China? And so you have a significantly wealthy upper class, but you have billions of people in poverty, and that's a huge problem. The countries, we're going down a list of some problems that China has. Countries' continued dependence on exports as the principal driver of growth, cheap credit, the misallocation of capital, which springs from the cheap credit. A lot of these things may sound familiar to you of what happened to us, the past 10 years or so. Well, China is not immune to them, and in some ways their problems may be worse. Local, provincial government indebtedness. What did we just talk about the last segment in the U.S.? State and local government pension liabilities. It's far worse in China right now. Policy making, focusing on short-term without addressing structural long-term issues, impact of rising wages, and resource dependability. These are just some of the major problems that China is having. One of the big issues, as I mentioned, is the real estate sector. One camp in China feels that the prices are too high. Real housing prices have risen 140% since the first quarter of 2007. It appears that prices have stabilized but not yet fallen. And they're trying to centrally control this from Beijing. A lot of the local governments are just ignoring what Beijing, and so there's huge, rampant speculation in land. Part of it's caused by the state-owned entities are the largest purchaser of land, the government, in China. And they did a study and they saw that prices rose about 27% more when the government was involved in the purchase than when they hadn't. And so they're contributing to their own rise by gobbling up the property. Price to rent values in Beijing have increased between 30 to 70% since 2007. In Beijing, the average house price is between 14 and 15 times income. As a planner, we recommend that people buy a house that's no more than 3 times their annual income. In Beijing, the average house price is 14 to 15 times annual income. I don't know why there's a debate about a housing bubble. It's clearly a housing bubble in China. Another major problem they have is that due to their population control in China, they've essentially cut off their labor force. And believe it or not, it's estimated that their labor force peaked in 2008 and will actually start falling as we go forward. Their labor force is actually falling. And if you know anything about demographics, this does not necessarily bode well for their growth. They're going to have to ramp up automation of the workforce, which they still can to some extent. The rising wages of the workforce is also going to be an issue with China, not only for their internal growth, but around the world. We've already seen some rebound of manufacturing back to the U.S. and to other places. Companies are becoming a little bit more weary of setting up plants in China, believe it or not. There's also, as I mentioned, the local government indebtedness. They estimate as 11.4 trillion Chinese dollars, equivalent to 71% of the country's nominal GDP. That's phenomenal. The cheap credit that is available over in China has just run rampant speculation, and they try to manage it centrally, but yet a lot of the local and provincial governments have been running up huge debts. Another thing, it's estimated water is a key constraint. China has 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of the global water resources, and their capacity is only a quarter of that of the world average. And so China has a lot of issues. They're certainly trying to address many of them. But my point in going over some of this is that we look here in the U.S. and sometimes, the China, even our own government has promoted China as the model for the future. But if you actually dig into some of the facts and figures, you see that China has some massive problems and in some ways larger than our own. Well, that's all the time that we have for this show. We hope you enjoyed it. For All Things Money, I'm David Blain. We'll see you next week.
The proceeding was a paid program. The opinions expressed are not necessarily those of WNBU and Inner Banks Media.